and welcome to this morning's workshop, which is Freedom from Food Intolerances. Thank you for joining me. I'll just get straight into it. So what we're going to be talking about today is when your life has been somewhat ruled by the foods that you can eat. So is your diet bringing you down? So we all want to, have lots of energy. We want our kids to be really healthy. We don't want to have to worry about food. We want to be carefree. I just need to say, admit. So I just muted everybody, just because obviously everybody has kids in the background and whatnot, but if you need to ask a question, just unmute yourself and ask the question. So I'll be able to see when you unmute yourself, so I'll know that you want to say something. So, maybe you're that person who comes home from work and you're bloated and you feel tired and you feel blech, or you know that you're going to react to all those foods that you love, and maybe your child has lots of rashes or tummy aches. So, it's a really common thing for kids to have lots of tummy aches, but it's not actually a normal thing for kids to have lots of tummy aches. So people will often say, oh, Susie's always got a sore tummy. And people just come to accept that Susie always has a sore tummy. But sometimes it's actually because there's a food that she is eating that she could quite easily actually avoid. Another issue associated with eating foods that you're intolerant to is weight gain. And this is by no means a magic bullet that if we just all avoid, dairy, then we'll lose weight, because that's not true, but it is certainly one aspect to be considered when you've addressed your exercise and your eating habits in other ways. And maybe you're just spending more time at the doctors seeing about various, random little issues that you have. So all these can be signs that your life is being ruled by food and food intolerances or food allergies. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. If I can get my page to go down. Okay. So this is me standing outside my office having a right old chuckle. So my background is that originally, 25 years ago, I did my degree in mechanical and food engineering. So I've always been really interested in food. However, that was obviously coming from a very different perspective than I do now. Then I did my master's in food science, also many, many years ago. But more recently, I did my advanced diploma in nutritional medicine. And I've trained in various different dietary approaches that can be used for mental health issues, gut issues, autoimmune issues, kids issues like autism and ADHD. So those two methodologies are GAPS and AIP, and that's a whole other discussion that we could go into, so I won't cover that now. I'm also a feeding therapist, so I work with children who have a very narrow range of foods to help them improve their food choices. And to top it all off, I'm in my final year of naturopathy. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about food allergies and food sensitivities and what the differences are between those, and then food intolerances and hypersensitivities. So as you can see, there's lots of different naming conventions for these things, and various people will use different naming conventions. So we'll just go through those. We'll talk about cross-reactivity, which is, I'll explain what that is later. We'll talk about the autoimmune aspect of food, leaky gut, and then how to manage these things with an elimination diet and just keeping a food journal. So as I say, I've just muted everybody, but if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask the question. That's totally fine. That's why you've turned up to see this. So we'll start with food allergy. So we've got our immune system, and it's there to fight off any foreign pathogens that might pose a threat to our health. So things like viruses, bacteria, parasites. And our immune system will make antibodies when we're exposed to these foreign threats. And these antibodies are called immunoglobulins, so Ig. But sometimes our immune system goes a little bit crazy and it will make these immunoglobulins to just normal foods. So instead of making them to bacteria or viruses or parasites, they'll make them just to food or environmental triggers like dust mite, pollen, those sorts of things. So there's 5 different types of immunoglobulins. And the one called immunoglobulin E is the one that causes what we would call to be a classic food allergy reaction. And the easy way to remember this is E is for emergency. So if you have an IgE reaction to a food and you eat the food, it can turn into an emergency pretty quickly. So this is where EpiPens are used when somebody has an IgE allergy. And your body will react to the food, like the peanut, and release histamine. And the symptoms of an IgE allergy can be nausea, coughing, that's because your airway starts to close over, trouble breathing, again, because your airway is closing, chest pain because of the inflammation in your lungs, itchy tongue and lips, and vomiting or stomach cramps. So we've all seen the pictures of the children with the big, big puffy lips where they've eaten a food and they've had this big, big reaction. And this can turn into an anaphylactic reaction. So I have unfortunately got experience of this with my own family. And my daughter used to be allergic to eggs. So she used to have an IgE reaction to eggs and actually to dairy, but she outgrew the dairy one at 15 months, but the egg one continued for a lot longer. And when she was 22 months, she was accidentally given food that contains eggs and she went into anaphylaxis. But the thing that a lot of people don't realize is that with a little child, so like she was under 2, anaphylaxis does not necessarily mean the puffy lips and the wheeze and hives or a rash. For her, she just ate the food, passed out cold on the floor, you know, very unresponsive, and had to be taken in an ambulance to the hospital. So don't think that anaphylaxis is always going to be this big dramatic swelling. It was quite different for her. And then eventually when she got to the hospital, she did a big vomit and she came around. So she didn't actually get the EpiPen because we didn't know that she was having anaphylaxis. That's a whole other story. But so it's just something to be aware of. If your child has an IgE reaction, always carry your EpiPen. And so there's 8 foods that are most of the food allergies. So 90% of food allergies will be these 8 foods. So peanuts, tree nuts, wheat, milk, soy, fish, eggs. However, and as you can see, all these foods contain protein. So peanuts contain protein, tree nuts contain protein, wheat contains gluten, which is protein. So they all contain protein, and that's usually the bit that we're reacting to, is the protein. But my other child, I'm so lucky, my other child is also allergic to chickpeas and lentils. So he's allergic to some tree nuts, and then lentils, green peas, and chickpeas. So although 90% fall within these 8 foods, it can be other foods, so it's something to be aware of. And his is an IgE reaction, and he carries an EpiPen because of that reaction, unfortunately. So I always think that it's a bit funny, the amount of people that go for allergy testing for IgE reactions, because it's really obvious. Like, I knew the first time I gave my son some soup with lentils in it, and he exploded. I was like, okay, so you're allergic to lentils. So it's really quite obvious. However, there are tests that you can do if you're not sure. So you can do an IgE antibody test, and your GP can order up to 4 of these per year under Medicare. So you really want to narrow it down. If you're not sure, you want to narrow it down to 4, and then your GP can test for that. Or you can go to see an allergy doctor, and they can do a skin prick test, and that will show a reaction. So they literally put a little prick in the skin and then drop some of the allergen sort of solution on it and see if it swells up in a hive. There is a high degree of false positives with these tests. So up to 50 or 60% of the blood tests and the skin pricks will give you a false positive. So that means you might do a blood test which says that you have an allergy to peanuts, but if you're actually challenged in a hospital setting with peanuts, you might not react. So they give you an idea. And to be honest, with my children, they've been perfectly accurate with no issues, but just bear it in mind that the gold standard for allergy testing has to be eating the food. The tests give you a good indication, but the gold standard test is actually eating the food. Oops, sorry. So that was IgE. So now we'll move on to food sensitivity, which can also be called a slow reaction food allergy, but for the purposes of today, we're just going to call it a food sensitivity. So, as I said, the food allergy involves IgE antibodies, so E for emergency. The food sensitivity involves IgG antibodies, so G for gradual. That's an easy way to remember it. And these are delayed responses. So it can take 2 hours or it can take up to 72 hours to see a reaction when you eat these foods. So that makes it really tricky to pinpoint. So if your child has, corn on a Monday and then is like in a really, really bad mood on a Wednesday, you're highly unlikely to say, oh my God, it's the corn from Monday. Or if your child has sleep apnea and wakes up 10 times every night, but also has Weet-Bix for breakfast every day, you're never going to make the correlation between wheat and sleep because they have the Weet-Bix every day and they sleep badly every day. So it's really hard to see a pattern with that. So common symptoms of these can be anything really, but some examples are headaches, bloating, fatigue, brain fog, anxiety, constipation, diarrhea, sleep issues, which are a really big one with children, swollen tonsils and adenoids. So this is another one that I see a lot with children. They have really swollen tonsils, they don't go down, they're on the waiting list to get their tonsils removed, but in the meantime they come to see me and we run some of these testings, and then within a month the tonsils are normal size and they're sleeping as normal. So I would highly recommend, if you have a child who is going to get their tonsils out because they've got sleep apnea or because they've just got permanently enlarged tonsils, please, please, please investigate IgG first. And then mood. So there's heaps of studies, for instance, in children with ADHD about the benefits of a low allergen diet in treating ADHD. So that's cutting out the gluten, the dairy, and all those highly allergenic foods. So how does this relate to the gut? Because we're all obviously very aware of gut health these days. It's big news. So whenever you eat a food that you're sensitive, you're causing continual inflammation in your gut lining, and that can lead to intestinal permeability, which is also called leaky gut, and we'll come to that in a minute. It can also disrupt the balance between the good bacteria and the not so good bacteria. So we have lots and lots of bacteria in our guts, and it's meant to be like a rainforest and everything's in balance, and there's some good guys, but there's also some bad guys, but it's all balanced and happy. But whenever you're eating food that you don't tolerate very well, it can disrupt that balance, which can lead to many, many issues. That chronic inflammation ultimately can lead to having IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome, or IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, such as ulcerative colitis. And it disrupts the whole internal system of your gut, and it puts your body into a state of constant inflammation and constant high alert. And so you can have an IgG reaction to the same things that you have the IgE reaction to. So really common: eggs, wheat, gluten, dairy, but it can be anything. And a lot of it has to do with your health, your gut health and your immune system. So I do see lots of gluten, dairy, egg sensitivities, but then I do also see things like soy and corn come up an awful lot as well. So this is where testing is really, really valuable, because there's that delayed reaction, that 2 to 72 hour window between eating the food and having a reaction. Testing can be really, really invaluable. And it's also invaluable because it tells you in black and white what you have an issue with or what your child has an issue with. So you're not sort of stabbing in the dark, oh, I think it was this, but oh, I'm not actually convinced, so we'll just keep eating it. You know, that can go on for years. So the different methods of testing are ELISA, ALCAT, hair analysis, and gut test. And these can certainly all be useful. However, I only do the first one, not just because my name is Lisa, but because it's actually got the most research behind it, and I find it to be the most accurate. I have used some of the other ones, and to be honest, they do actually give good results, but there's no science behind them, and I find it really difficult to encourage people to do testing when there's no science behind it, because it just doesn't really sit very well with me. And if you see a practitioner who does other types and they get results, that's perfectly fine, but that's just not how I practice. So I do this top one, the ELISA. So that was your IgE and your IgG, and now we'll move on to more just food intolerance. So these food intolerances don't involve the immune system, so you don't have to learn another IgG something for this, and there's no histamine released. And generally, these are because we don't have enough of the correct enzyme to digest the food. So this is where you might get just bloating, gas, diarrhea, belly aches, cramping. And I have to say, if you've had great gut health your whole life, and then all of a sudden you start to get these issues, then you do need to see a doctor about that, just to rule out anything serious. Intolerances can develop over time. You can have them from childhood. Lots of people just live with them and don't really do anything about them. But if it comes on suddenly, definitely go to your doctor and get that checked out. So it's really common to have an intolerance to gluten or an intolerance to dairy. And when you have an intolerance to dairy, it's because sometimes you don't have enough lactase to break down the lactose. So if you can't drink milk, but you're fine with hard cheese, then you probably just have a bit of a lactase deficiency. And this is common if you've had gastro, if you've had a gut bug, then many people will be temporarily lactose intolerant, but that will come back, and that's not forever. Lots of people come to see me and tell me they have a problem with dairy, so they have the lactose-free milk, but that will only work if you've got a problem with the lactose. If you actually have an allergy to dairy, so either IgE or IgG, there's no point in buying lactose-free milk because you're still having the dairy protein. So you need to, if you know you have a problem with dairy, you need to work out if you have a problem with the protein or with the lactose to know how to address that. And then gluten intolerance is very, very common and can be for many reasons. So some of the reasons are listed here. So it can be the fructans in wheat. So that's like a FODMAP issue when you can't tolerate fructans. So it might not be the gluten, it actually might be the fructans. It might not actually be the gluten, but it could be the glyphosate, so the weed killer that's sprayed on the wheat, in which case you might be okay with organic wheat, which doesn't have that. Many wheats have been bred to have higher proteins, so that could be your issue, but you might be okay with an ancient type of wheat. And then you might not be able to tolerate gluten because you've got some intestinal permeability. And sorry, there isn't really great tests for this. You can do breath testing to see if you've got a problem with fructose, but it's not that accurate, and it's not something that I really do much in clinic. I prefer to, once I've ruled out IgE or IgG, I prefer just to take a really good history from people about when their problems started, what foods they eat, and then if I need to, do an elimination diet with them, which we'll talk about in a minute. So then there's all these other hypersensitivities that don't fit into any of the categories we've talked about so far. So caffeine, some people are very sensitive to caffeine, which can be a genetic thing. So some people are slow metabolizers of caffeine, some people are fast metabolizers of caffeine, which is why some people can have, you know, an espresso at 10 p.m. and go straight to bed, and some people can't have coffee past midday. There's other issues with coffee that people might be sensitive to. So it could be the chemicals that have been sprayed on the coffee beans. There can be some fungus on the coffee, so nobody wants to hear that, but mycotoxins. So just when the caffeine is stored, or the coffee is stored, some fungus can grow, or it can be the saponins in coffee. Salicylates, again, is common with kids who have hyperactivity, or kids that have like really red ears and things like that. And salicylates are found in lots of fruits and vegetables, but also in preservatives. So a good clue for me that a child or a person has a problem with salicylates is if they have Panadol and they go crazy, because Panadol has lots of flavors and colors in them. And there's diets that just exclude salicylates, like the RPA, Royal Prince Alfred Hospital diet. It just excludes salicylates. So cut them out, we're done. And that is a one-way street to nowhere, because you end up eating rice, chicken, pear, and celery or something, and it doesn't actually get to the underlying reason of why you can't tolerate salicylates. So my practice is always about getting to the root cause. So if you have a problem with salicylates, don't cut out salicylates and leave it there. You need to get to the root cause, which often involves your liver. Amines are found, they're very high in really great foods like sauerkraut and kombucha. So if you've been trying to improve your gut health and you've been drinking kombucha every day and you feel worse than ever, possibly you have an issue with the amines, and that can cause hives, headaches, itchy eyes, rashes, all those sorts of things. Sulfites are used to preserve fruit. So if you eat dried fruit, especially something like an apricot, and you have a bad reaction, it can be the sulfites. It also can be polyols in something like apricots, which is a FODMAP issue. But if you generally react to dried apple as well, has heaps of sulfites in it, which is why it's so white, and it can give you a really cracking headache. Food colorings, I always tell my kids, when I used to eat Skittles when I was a child, so like I'm talking, you know, 6-7-year-old child, my throat would close over and just get really scratchy straight away. So obviously one of those food colorings I couldn't tolerate. It's just no bad thing. I can't have Skittles. And that can cause lots of behavioral issues. And then artificial sweeteners can cause headaches in people and lots of other issues. So we've got something called cross-reactivity, just to keep things even more complicated. So cross-reactivity is when you're allergic to food, but that actually makes you not be able to tolerate other foods. So it's where the proteins of one food that you're allergic to is similar to the protein in other foods. And this is a list of the foods that can cross-react with gluten. So if you know you're sensitive to gluten and you've done your best to adopt a gluten-free diet, but you're still having issues, then you need to look at all of these foods, I'm afraid. So dairy, brewer's yeast, baker's yeast, not a big problem for most people. Coffee and chocolate, and then millet, soy, corn, rice, and potato. So the other thing is, if you've done a test, so one of the foods that I test for in my IgG test is coffee, and it cross-reacts with chocolate. So if I do a child's test and they react with coffee, it's like, well, they don't drink coffee, obviously, but they need to cut out chocolate. Lots of breastfeeding mums will cut out dairy because they can tell that it causes a reaction in their child, and they'll switch to soy milk, and they'll still be having issues, but that's because the protein in soy is very like the protein in dairy. So when you start working through your reactions and what to avoid, it's good to have a bit of insight from a nutritionist or a naturopath who can actually guide you on the other foods that you may have to remove. Just another sort of interesting point here on the gluten-free diet is that if you have removed gluten and you're not feeling any better, you need to look at your personal care products. So I bought a conditioner recently, and it was one of those beautiful natural brands, I can't remember, but it had wheat protein in it, so it had gluten in it, so that had to go straight to the bin. So you need to be very careful about personal care as well. So then autoimmune is a bit of a passion of mine, because from a medical point of view, if you have an autoimmune disease, there are not many treatments that actually get to the autoimmune problem. The medical treatments will often treat the symptoms that the autoimmune issue have given you. So with your thyroid, they'll give you thyroid hormone because that's what you're lacking in. But quite often, there's no thought given to actually how to slow down the self-destruction of the thyroid. And that's something that I'm very passionate about. So what is food autoimmune reactivity? So various things can disrupt our tolerance to antigens. So an antigen is just a foreign body, so something that your body can potentially react to. So disease, injury, stress, trauma, surgery, drugs, environmental triggers can all disrupt our tolerance to foods. So disease can even be things like an overgrowth of certain bacteria in your gut. Environmental triggers can be having excess mercury in your body, either from your dental fillings or from eating too many big fish like flake or tuna or swordfish. Stress is a huge, huge issue for many people. Many people with thyroid issues, they're overworked, they're not getting any downtime, they're not getting enough sleep, and eventually their thyroid just packs it in, basically. So all these things will make us less tolerant to foods. And when that happens, when we lose our tolerance to the foods, then our immune system starts to react not only to the foods that we've lost tolerance to, but also to our body's own tissues. And that's called molecular mimicry. And a really good example of that is that the protein structure of gluten is very similar to the tissue in your thyroid and in your joints. So if you've got rheumatoid arthritis or Hashimoto's thyroiditis, every time you eat gluten, it makes your body attack itself. So the number one thing to do with any autoimmune disease is to cut out gluten. So I have a very, very, very minor autoimmune issue, which I keep 100% under control by modifying my diet and absolutely having a zero tolerance for gluten. So I never, ever, ever eat gluten. So leaky gut, I've kind of touched on earlier, and it's also called intestinal permeability. So kind of the technical name for it is intestinal permeability, but many people will just call it leaky gut. And leaky gut is basically your gut should have cells in it, like all stuck together like that, so nothing can get through. But when you've got leaky gut, they all open out a bit. And you can see there's gaps now between my fingers, so tight, leaky. And that means that components of foods that were never meant to get out of the intestines can actually get into your bloodstream, and they can trigger an inflammatory response. And there's many reasons for leaky gut, but it can be because you're eating a food that you're allergic to or sensitive to. It can be because you've had really bad gastro or an infection or lots of other things. If you have too much sugar, if you don't eat enough fiber, if you drink too much alcohol, so that includes wine, I'm afraid, G&Ts, or if you've had too many antibiotics, you're drinking chlorinated drinking water, all of these can contribute to leaky gut. And every time you eat gluten, so everybody, not just people who are sensitive to gluten, every time you eat gluten, your cells will temporarily come apart and they'll come back together again. So if you eat gluten, if you don't have any allergies or sensitivities to gluten and you eat it 2 or 3 times a week, that's fine. You'll like decrease your chance of having an issue with it in the future. If you look at a typical Australian diet, it is very, very common for people to actually eat gluten 4 or 5 times every single day. So the cells in your gut wall never come back together. So if you eat it twice a week, they'll come apart, and then 6 hours later they'll come back together, and then you're good for a few days. If you're eating it 4 or 5 times a day, your cells come apart and they never get to come back together because you've already eaten more gluten. So even if you do eat gluten, don't eat it every day. Just eat it like 2 or 3 times every week, and that will reduce your chances of having issues in the future. Also, fiber is good for everybody. And when I say fiber, I don't mean all bran or sultana bran. I mean fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds. So you do not need to eat grains to get your 30 grams of fiber per day. Alcohol, I know it's been tough. It's been a tough year for everybody. And certainly people have been drinking a lot more at home, but it has so many negative health consequences, and one of them is contributing to leaky gut. Chemicals in the home, we should all be moving to low tox options. They're much cheaper. You don't have to buy Earth Choice everything. You can just switch to things like vinegar and bicarb soda for lots of things, and reduce your medications, reduce your exposure to antibiotics. Absolutely. So food elimination diet is something that I do a lot with people, and I do it when they don't want their child to get blood taken, or for some reason they're not suitable for that because they're under the age of 1, or some other complicated issue. And I do it when people don't want to spend the money, because it's $199 to do the food sensitivity testing, and some people don't want to spend that money. They'd rather do it, what's the word, experientially. So an elimination diet is actually a brilliant way to find out if you've got allergies or sensitivities or intolerances. So it will cover all of those things that we talked about. And you need to do it for about 30 days. The elimination diet that I use is based on the Canadian Naturopathic Society guidelines. And I have a whole sort of meal plan that goes along with that. So families can just take away the meal plans and the recipes and know exactly what they need to be eating. And then the downside of the elimination diet is that you have to cut out everything for a month. But not only that, is when you reintroduce things, you don't just bring everything back in at the same time again, because then you learn nothing, because you'll get all the old reactions back and you still won't know why. So you need to eliminate everything for about 30 days and then reintroduce foods one at a time. So one new food every 2 or 3 days. And certainly that is painstaking and difficult, but it is brilliant and you learn so much for it. And you also, even in the process of doing the elimination diet, you improve your diet or your kids' diet, because you're trying new foods that you wouldn't normally have tried. You're stepping away from the Weet-Bix and milk for breakfast, and you're having to make new sort of choices every day. So that in itself is a really valuable experience. And so these are the benefits of the elimination diet. So lots of people think, well, I've been eating dairy all my life and I'm fine. Or no, it's not wheat, because I eat wheat every day, there's no problem. But try cutting out those foods for a month and notice that, oh, that pain in my hip has gone, or oh, that little scaly bit of skin on my neck has gone. So once you take away those triggers, you'll notice changes. And then when you reintroduce the food, you know, oh, my hip is sore again. So I'm using the example of a hip because that's actually what happened to me many, many years ago. I did a bit too much running and I got some inflammation in my hip. And I spent a year going to physios, osteos, acupuncture, you know, doing everything, taking the fish oil, doing all those things. And nothing helped and I couldn't run. It was too sore. So eventually I did the paleo diet. And so that cuts out grains, dairy, all processed food, sugar, alcohol. And I did that. And by about day 5, my hip was better. And so I did a month. And then I tried to reintroduce the grains and instantly my hip got sore again. So, I mean, this is, 10 years ago. Never in a million years did I think that my running injury was linked to the grains that I was eating, but 100% it was, and it's never been a problem since. There's lots of benefits for your digestive health because you're removing all those inflammatory and irritating foods. Then your gut health will improve, which will help get the bacteria back into better balance and reduce inflammation and just overall reduce your chances of getting diseases in the future. And something that you can do straight away at home without any help from anybody is to start a food journal. So record everything that you eat and drink for at least 3 to 5 days. And note when you're eating and what you're doing when you're eating, how you felt before you ate and then how you felt after you ate. So things to look out for is your energy levels, sleepiness, feeling drained, achy, bloating, gassy, and the same after you eat. Lots of people, when they cut out gluten and then reintroduce it, realize that they didn't feel tired and exhausted after lunchtime when they weren't eating gluten. So fatigue is a really common issue with gluten. And just write down in your words what's happening. You don't have to show it to anybody else. Obviously, it's an amazing asset if you do decide to see a nutritionist that you've already developed this knowledge base yourself and you can bring this along to your nutritionist. And then think about your moods and your emotions and how you responded over the day. So my clinic, this is what I do. So I do a lot of IgG testing. If you have a look at my Facebook page and you look at the reviews, you'll see lots of reviews from parents, and it's where I've done usually the IgG testing, and it's really made dramatic improvements. I do a lot of elimination diets for the reasons that I mentioned before. An even stricter version of an elimination diet that I do is the autoimmune elimination diet. And that's for people who have things like ankylosing spondylitis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Hashimoto's. So they exclude a lot of things and then again reintroduce them one by one. And I can also give guidance on IgE reactions. I can test for them, but why bother? Because you can get your GP to test them for free. But if you've been to see an allergy doctor and you've walked away with a list of allergies and you're just like, where do I go from here? Because they don't really guide you on what to avoid because they're not looking at it from a food perspective. So if you've had IgG test results and you would like some interpretation or some guidance on what to eat, I can help with that too. So I will email you all my contact details, my Facebook page, my Instagram page. If you want to follow me, I send out a newsletter about once every 2 weeks and I post on Instagram and Facebook most days. So we are bang on time for 40 minutes. So we do have time for questions. So if you would like to ask a question, just unmute yourself and shout out and I'll do my best to answer. If you don't have any questions, you're free to leave. But if you have questions, just ask.
Hi Lisa, it's Natalia. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
So I've done the elimination diet before and found that I have intolerance to onion and garlic.
Yeah.
I think I've mentioned this to you before in an unrelated topic, but so if I were to come to you, what next? What can we do, I guess, to reintroduce it or to find out what the root cause is, or how to fix it, if you will?
Yeah. So with onions and garlic, they're high FODMAP foods. And the low FODMAP diet has been really popular in Australia for the last 10 years to treat IBS, but it doesn't get to the root cause. So what the low FODMAP diet does, it removes those fermentable foods. When you eat a fermentable food, then your gut bacteria go crazy because they're getting fed, and that causes the bloating, the wind, the diarrhea. But we want to actually feed our gut bacteria because that's how they survive. And if you stay in a low FODMAP diet for a long time, your good bacteria will die along with your bad bacteria. So if I use the low FODMAP diet with somebody, I make them promise that they'll do it for 6 weeks and then come back and we'll reassess, because it doesn't get to the root cause. So if you've been doing a low FODMAP diet because you have IBS, we need to find out why you have IBS. And in, I would say 80% of the cases, if not more, but I would say 80% of the cases of IBS that I see, the person actually has something called small intestine bacterial overgrowth. So we're meant to have bacteria in our large intestine, but we're not really meant to have them further up in our small intestine. But for many reasons, sometimes they migrate, and that's when people get IBS. And so the test that I would do would be a SIBO breath test, and that will check to see if you've got an overgrowth of bacteria in your small intestine. If you do, then yes, I would put you on a low FODMAP diet for about 6 weeks, but at the same time, I would give you antimicrobial foods and supplements to take to decrease the number of bacteria in your small intestine. And I would also give you things that are going to keep your gut moving, because one reason why people get SIBO is because their gut isn't moving well enough, so it slows down. And it can slow down because you've had gastro, because you've had laparoscopies, appendectomies, cesarean sections, gallbladder removals. All that surgery in your abdomen causes adhesions, which stops your gut moving properly. So then I work with a physio as well to work on that, but I can give you supplements to keep things moving. So that was a very long answer, but basically if you can't eat onions and garlic, I would test you for SIBO, see if you have SIBO, treat the SIBO, and then you can reintroduce those foods. That's the plan.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. That was exactly what I, answered my question perfectly. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Would anybody else like to ask a question while you have me here? Nope, that's totally fine. I will send you all an email, and this has hopefully been recorded. So I'll send you a link to watch it again on YouTube, just in case you wanted to look at any of it again. And if you have any questions that you don't want to ask in a public forum, then please just drop me an email later and I'll do my best to answer. Okay? So thanks for joining me, and I'll hopefully talk to some of you soon.
Thank you.